Welcome to this post on Viking archaeology, in which I'll discuss new research on Viking Age fortresses. And to show you what this is all about, I've driven up north to Ystgaard in northern Jutland in Denmark to show you what a Viking Age fortress looked like. This fortress was built, we know from tree ring dates, in the 970s, almost certainly by King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark. And what you can see here behind me, reconstructed from the excavations, are the circular ramparts with the 4 entrance gates, and you can almost certainly also see traces of the large wooden buildings which was inside the fortress. And if I turn around behind me, you can see a reconstruction of one of those buildings, 30-meter long wooden hall, and there would have been 16 of those in this fortress. And you can see a small area over there in the back with some higher grass, and what that is the cemetery, the graves from the Ystgaard fortress. I discussed one of those, Ystgaard grave 4, in an earlier post together with Professor Rostal. You can also see behind me there are traces of the ditch which surrounded the fortress. In order to explore a bit more what we currently know about Viking Age fortresses, I've come back to less windy quarters. Now, Ystgaard and other sites have been known for quite a while, and they're named commonly after the first site that was discovered way back in 1934, and it's this site, Trelleborg on Sjælland. When Trelleborg was discovered, it was a real enigma because nobody had imagined that Viking Age Scandinavians could build on such a scale. It's even bigger than the Ystgaard fortress we were just at. And in some sense, the enigma only became more pronounced when more sites were found around Denmark and southern Sweden that were of the same scale and clearly of a similar pattern. Now, what really sets the Trelleborg type fortresses apart is their exact geometry. All were made with precisely circular ramparts and 4 actual streets that crosses at right angles in the middle of the fortresses, and 4 large blocks of wooden buildings, all meticulously measured out. And this whole apparatus was replicated at several locations all across the Danish kingdom. Now, with all the effort put into the ring fortresses and with all the violence associated with the Viking Age, you might have imagined fortification to be a common thing in Viking Age Scandinavia, but in fact it's absolutely not. There are plenty of fortresses to be found in the Scandinavian countryside, and for the Iversen of Oslo has recently put them all together in this beautiful map which shows you where they occur in middle Sweden and in Norway in particular. But when they are examined archaeologically, they almost invariably turn out to have been built and used in the migration period, so a few hundred years before the Viking Age. Ystgaard, in this recent PhD study, unfortunately unpublished, has discussed why that is so. She finds that the HILLFORTS around Scandinavia were associated with particular styles of fighting and particular styles of weaponry, and for that reason they were useful in some conditions and not in others. And the way of fighting which became common in the Viking Age generally did not encourage the use of fortresses. Fortresses were also common among the Slavs in the Viking Age, for instance in Poland and the areas of Germany bordering the Baltic Sea. And it became common in other North European countries, not least in the Netherlands and the Anglo-Saxon England in the Viking period, in part as a response to Viking armies. It may have been inspiration from these areas which prompted Harald Bluetooth to experiment with fortress buildings in the 970s and 80s. A sort of experiment it certainly was, because his fortresses appear to have been used only for about a decade, after which they were abandoned. In recent years there's been lots of new research which has shown us more about this strange episode. As you can see from this map, there's currently 5 sites of this group known in present Denmark: Akersborg and Ystgaard in Jutland, Nonnebakken on Fyn, and Trelleborg and Borgen on Sjælland. There's also 2 sites in southern Sweden, in Skåne, associated in some way with this group: Borgeby near Lund and Trelleborg on the south coast. Both were discovered in the 1990s, and Trelleborg was extensively excavated. That site differs in some way from the standard Trelleborg type sites. Borgeby in Lund has still not been touched by many excavations, and we don't know how well it fits with the group. Now, Trelleborg on Sjælland was the first site investigated already in the 1930s and 40s, but more recently there hasn't been a lot of fieldwork on that particular site. About 10 years ago, the project Kongsborg tried to understand the landscape context of Trelleborg better. They were testing the hypothesis that this could have been built as a shipbuilding and harbour site. They came to the conclusion that it's almost certainly not, so that's not the reason that this and other fortresses were built for. There's also been very interesting isotopic studies of skeletons from Trelleborg's cemetery. They were able to show that at least some of the individuals buried there were not locals, so they're perhaps more likely to have been the king's retinue than local people called for military service on the fortress. For a long time, Nonnebakken on Fyn was the least known site, because it was located in the middle of the modern town Odense and in fact had been completely dug away. But it was known from this beautiful 16th century print, and you can see it there right on the bottom. It was also known, in fact, from a cadastral map from the early 1800s here, where you still make out the circular ramparts there. But it was believed until recently that the site had been completely eradicated. However, Mads Runge and his team from Odense City Museum has recently done a great job at investigating the site. They've conducted excavations and found that there still remains preserved underground. They've had geophysical surveys done, and they've been able to locate at least one of the gates, and also to show that there are probably traces of buildings preserved at the site. Now, the largest of all Trelleborg type sites is Akersborg in northern Jutland. Whereas Fyrkat had 16 houses within the ramparts, Akersborg had 48, so it's an absolutely huge site. This was actually one of the first places excavated. It was excavated in the 1940s and 50s by people from the National Museum of Denmark, but due to the untimely death of the excavator C.G. Schultz, the records remained unpublished for many decades. I became involved with this site around 2007 when I joined the team to publish the excavations together with Dr. Else Rosdahl and Anne Pedersen. And we proceeded to complete this work in 2014 with a beautiful book which shows what really came out of some of the most important and certainly some of the biggest Viking Age excavations that has been conducted in Denmark to date. One unintended thing that came out of the Akersborg investigations was that as we went along, I became more and more convinced that the pattern of fortresses, such as it was known, was incomplete, that there had to be at least one or several more sites for the whole network of fortresses to make sense. So once we'd finished the book, I took contact to a colleague, Nana Holm of the Museum of Southeast Denmark, to look together at a site which we had become aware of near the town of Køge, south of Copenhagen in Sjælland. That site on a field that was called Borgen, the castle ring, had been known earlier, and it had even been suggested that the earthworks there could have been Trelleborg type ring fortresses, but earlier trial excavations had seemed to suggest that it was not. What we did was, in the first place, we were able to use LiDAR data, so very detailed measurements of the terrain, to see the outline of the fortress, as it did indeed appear completely circular. Next, we were able to use geophysical surveys to see what was beneath the ground, and that was the real breakthrough, because we could see on the images that appeared that the Borgring site had very similar feature and a very similar meticulously geometric outline as the other fortresses. That happened in 2013 and 14, and since then we've had 3 years of fieldwork there, which has shown us a lot about Borgring. As it seems now, after the fieldwork, it would appear that Borgring was a site that was planned together with the other ring fortresses, but may not have been finished to the intent. We don't see any evidence of buildings there, but the ramparts were planned out in the same way as, for instance, Fyrkat. What the Borgring excavations seem to show us now is that it was useful for someone, presumably Harald Bluetooth, to build a fortress and construct and complete the ramparts without actually using it for very much. This could have been just something that was undertaken as a show of power. Perhaps it was a way of showing reluctant subjects who was in control of the land. Perhaps it's as simple as that. But I think we can also suggest a rather more subtle use. If we look at how fortresses were used in other countries in Northern Europe at the time, we can see that large fortresses like the Trelleborg type fortresses were used in Anglo-Saxon England or in the Slavic lands for populations in an area to take shelter in when enemies were in the land. The strategy would then be for everybody assembled in the fortress to keep out the enemies until an army could be called to expel the enemies. And people were quite often successful in that strategy. That's how the Anglo-Saxon kings finally came to control the Viking threat. That's how Slavic and German armies fought in 10th century northern Germany. And we know that Harald Bluetooth was threatened on his southern border. There are reports of wars with Otto II, Emperor of the Ottonian Empire. And we know even that at one point Harald Bluetooth had to summon troops from Norway who came to help him on the southern border, on the Dannevirke, about the border to Germany. Now, in that situation, if the king was regularly forced to call in his fighting men from across the country, the fortresses could have been constructed as a way of showing to populations that there was a strategy available for them, that there was a way to ensure the fighting men and the rest of the population that there would be safety even when the men were away on expedition. And I think today that's probably the most likely scenario we can use for what Harald Bluetooth and his contemporaries had in mind when they constructed this remarkable net of fortresses. Well, I thank you now for following me on this post, and I hope that you will return again for more posts on Viking archaeology.